Welcome back to the Olive Grove podcast. It's all about, taking those intriguing sources you bring us and diving deep into them, really unearthing those hidden gems of knowledge. Today we're taking a trip into the future, exploring the prophecies about Jerusalem from Zechariah chapter 14. And our guide for this deep dive is My Christian Space's website. And let me tell you, there are some pretty captivating events described here, like the Mount of Olives splitting and the arrival of Yeshua Messiah.
Yeah, it's quite a dramatic scene, isn't it? Zechariah doesn't hold back on the powerful imagery, but before we get too swept up in the drama of chapter 14, it's helpful to understand the context within the larger book of Zechariah.
Right, so how does this chapter fit into the whole message of Zechariah?
Well, Zechariah was prophesying during a time of rebuilding and restoration for the Jewish people after they returned from exile in Babylon. And while there was a lot of hope and anticipation, there were challenges too, and uncertainty. Zechariah's prophecies offered both warnings and encouragements, calling the people to faithfulness and reminding them of God's ultimate plan for their future.
That makes sense. So with that in mind, let's jump into chapter 14. It starts off with a pretty unsettling image of Jerusalem falling to the nations.
Yeah, verses 1 and 2 paint a vivid picture of this, describing the city being captured and its people plundered. It's a sobering reminder that even Jerusalem, God's chosen city, isn't immune to hardship and conflict.
But even in all that turmoil, there's this emphasis on God's sovereignty.
Right. Absolutely. The text specifically says that God is the one who gathers all the nations against Jerusalem. It's crucial because it reminds us, even when things seem chaotic, God is ultimately in control, orchestrating events according to his purpose.
It's like he's setting the stage for something big.
Okay.
And in the middle of all this, we see the mention of a remnant, a group of people who stay faithful to God.
Precisely. Verse 2 tells us that. Half the city will go into exile, but the rest of the people will not be cut off from the city. This points to the idea that even in the face of adversity and judgment, God preserves a faithful remnant who will carry forward his promises. This concept of a remnant, it's woven throughout the Old Testament, and it points to the resilience of God's people and the enduring nature of his covenant.
Right. It's a reminder that God always deserves a faithful core, even when things feel bleak. So let me move to verses 3 and 4, and things get really interesting. Enter Yeshua Messiah, arriving dramatically in the Mount of Olives, causing the mountain itself to split in two. Now that's a visual. The text describes this dramatic event where the Mount of Olives splits, forming a massive valley running east to west. It's fascinating how this imagery connects to other biblical instances of mountains representing obstacles or strongholds being overcome by God. Think about the parting in the Red Sea, or even Jesus' statement about faith, being able to move mountains.
That's a great point. It's like this splitting of the Mount of Olives symbolizes a decisive intervention by God, a breaking down of barriers, and a clearing of the way for his ultimate plan to unfold.
Exactly. It's a powerful symbol of God's power to reshape reality and overcome any obstacle that stands in the way of his purposes. And what about the people? During this, the text mentions something about them fleeing to this new valley.
Yes. Verse 5 describes the remnant, seeking refuge in this valley. It even mentions a specific location, Azal, which, while we can't pinpoint its exact location today, it gives us a sense of the geographical scale of this valley. What's interesting is this event is compared to a previous earthquake in the days of King Uzziah, highlighting the magnitude of this divine intervention. It's as if God is saying, remember that time when the earth shook? Well, this is going to be even bigger.
It definitely sets the scene for something truly awe-inspiring. And then Yeshua returns
with his followers
to establish his millennial reign.
That's right. Verse 5 clearly states that Adonai, my God, will come, and all the holy ones with him. Now, it's important to clarify that Adonai is the Hebrew name for God, often translated as Lord in English, and the term Adonai Tzvat, which we'll encounter later, means Lord of hosts, emphasizing God's sovereign power over all creation, including heavenly armies.
Thanks for clarifying that. I always find those Hebrew terms interesting.
Yeah.
But they can be a little confusing sometimes. So Yeshua returns with his followers, and this aligns with other New Testament passages about the second coming.
Absolutely. This event described in Zechariah resonates with Paul's teachings in 1 Corinthians 15 and 1 Thessalonians 4 about the return of Christ and the resurrection of believers. It paints a powerful picture of a triumphant return where God's people are gathered and protected under his reign.
It's a reminder that this event isn't just about destruction and judgment. It's ultimately about restoration and the establishment of God's kingdom on earth.
And speaking of transformation, Zechariah goes on to describe some pretty unique lighting conditions in this New Jerusalem. No more day or night, just perpetual light.
Yeah, verses 6 and 7 describe this fascinating phenomenon. It says, "There will be neither bright light nor thick darkness, but a unique state where by evening there will be light." This raises an interesting question. What is the source of this light? We get a hint in Revelation 21, which describes the New Jerusalem, illuminated by God's glory. So God himself becomes the source of light in this new creation. It's a beautiful image of his constant presence and the absence of any spiritual darkness.
Exactly. And it ties into the theme of transformation we've been discussing.
Right.
Not only is the physical landscape transformed, but the very nature of time and light is altered.
It's like Zechariah is giving us a glimpse into a reality that transcends our current understanding of the world.
It's a vision of a world completely enveloped in God's presence, where even the natural order reflects his glory.
And this transformation also impacts the water sources in and around Jerusalem. Zechariah describes fresh water flowing from Jerusalem, transforming the Dead Sea, and bringing life to the surrounding areas.
This imagery is incredibly powerful. Verse 8 describes this life-giving water flowing from Jerusalem, splitting into two streams that flow towards the eastern and western seas. What's fascinating here is that the text explicitly states that this flow is continuous, independent of natural weather patterns. This points to a supernatural source, a divine provision that sustains life and transforms even the most barren of landscapes.
It's like that scene in Ezekiel 47, where the prophet sees water flowing from the temple, becoming this mighty river, bringing healing and life wherever it goes.
Exactly. And the Dead Sea, known for its high salt content and lack of life, becomes a testament to God's power to renew and restore even the most desolate places. It's a powerful metaphor for the transformative power of God's grace.
Before we get too far into the rest of this incredible chapter, I wanted to take a quick moment to talk about something that's very close to our hearts. Here at the Olive Grove Podcast, as many of you know, this podcast is an extension of the amazing community over at My Christian Space.
That's right. My Christian Space is a wonderful online platform dedicated to exploring and sharing the richness of the Christian faith, fostering community, and supporting impactful ministries around the world.
And speaking of impactful ministries, we're so excited to share about the incredible work being done by Enduring Freedom Ministries.
Yes. Enduring Freedom Ministries is making a real difference, particularly in Jerusalem, by focusing on providing essential resources and support to those in need. They are actively involved in various projects aimed at improving the lives of individuals and families in the Holy Land.
And we're thrilled to share that they're currently working to establish a much-needed food pantry in Jerusalem, a project we wholeheartedly support here at the Olive Grove Podcast.
This food pantry will be a lifeline for many families and individuals struggling with food insecurity, providing them with vital nourishment and hope. It aligns perfectly with the message of Zechariah 14, which speaks of God's provision and care for his people.
We know that many of you listening are passionate about supporting this kind of impactful work, and we want to encourage you to consider joining us in making this food pantry a reality. Even a small donation can make a huge difference in the lives of those who will benefit from this initiative.
You can find more information about Enduring Freedom Ministries and their food pantry project on the My Christian Space website. Just click on the link in our show notes. We truly believe that together we can help bring nourishment and hope to the people of Jerusalem.
Now let's get back to Zechariah 14 and see what else unfolds in this fascinating prophecy. What happens after this dramatic arrival of Yeshua and the transformation of the land and water?
Well, things took an interesting turn as Zechariah shifts his focus to the establishment of God's kingdom on earth and the consequences for those who oppose his rule. This is where we'll see the implications of God's sovereignty play out on a global scale.
Okay, I'm ready to delve deeper into that. But for now, let's pause here and pick up this thread in the next part of our deep dive.
Sounds good to me. This chapter is so rich with imagery and theological significance that it deserves to be unpacked thoughtfully.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to reflect on what we've covered so far and consider how these prophecies might resonate with your own lives and understanding of God's plan for the world. We'll be back soon to continue our exploration of Zechariah 14.
Welcome back to the Olive Grove Podcast. When we left off, we were talking about the dramatic transformation of Jerusalem and the surrounding landscape, with fresh water flowing from the city, bringing life even to the Dead Sea.
Yeah, those are some pretty striking images of renewal and restoration. It sets the stage for a world where God's presence is tangible
Yeah.
and transformative. But what happens next? How does Zechariah describe the establishment of God's kingdom on earth?
Well, verse 9 lays it out pretty clearly. Then Adonai will be king over the whole world. On that day, Adonai will be the only one, and his name will be the only name. So it signifies a time of complete and undisputed sovereignty where God's rule is acknowledged throughout the entire world.
It sounds like a radical shift from how things are now, where there's so much division and conflict.
It certainly is. Zechariah is pointing towards a future where all human systems of power and authority will ultimately bow before God's ultimate kingship.
And what does this kingship look like? How does God's rule manifest in this new world?
Well, in verses 10 and 11, we see further transformation. A land around Jerusalem becomes like the Arabah, a fertile plain, and Jerusalem itself is raised up and securely established. You know, it's interesting how the text mentions specific locations within Jerusalem, like Benjamin's Gate, the Corner Gate, the Tower of Hanel. It really grounds this prophecy in those concrete geographical details.
Right. It's like Zechariah is saying, this isn't just some spiritual transformation. It's physical, tangible reality that will impact the very landscape of the world.
Exactly. It emphasizes that this isn't some vague, ethereal notion of God's kingdom. It's a kingdom that will be established in a real place, a physical place, and its effects will be felt throughout the entire world.
But not everyone welcomes this new order.
Right.
There's mention of judgment against those who oppose God's rule.
That's right. Verse 12 describes a plague, striking those who fought against Jerusalem, causing their flesh to rot away. It's a chilling description, and it certainly raises questions about the nature of divine judgment.
It's a reminder that God's justice is as much a part of his character as his love and mercy. And this judgment isn't limited to individuals. It also impacts the nations that oppose God's will.
Absolutely. Verses 13 and 14 describe a scene of chaos and confusion among those who've opposed God's plan. People turn on each other. You see the breakdown of social order and the sense of desperation that grips those who've rejected God's rule.
It's like their own rebellion and opposition
to God ultimately leads to their undoing. They create their own chaos through their resistance to his order.
Right. It's a powerful reminder that ultimately aligning ourselves with God's will leads to peace. And flourishing while resisting him only results in destruction and despair.
So amidst all this talk of judgment and destruction, what happens to those who are left? What's the ultimate outcome for the nations in relation to this new kingdom? Well, that's where things take a surprising turn. Instead of complete annihilation, Zechariah describes a remarkable act of grace and reconciliation.
Oh, is this where the nations are called to worship God in Jerusalem?
You got it. Verse 16 describes how those who survived the plague are compelled to go up to Jerusalem every year to worship the king, Adonai Tzfat, and celebrate the festival of Sukkot.
Sukkot, the festival of tabernacles. That's interesting that Zechariah specifically mentions this festival.
It is, isn't it? Sukkot, also known as the Feast of Booths, is a time when Jewish people remember God's provision and protection during their 40 years of wandering in the wilderness after the exodus from Egypt. It's a celebration of dwelling in God's presence, even in temporary and vulnerable circumstances.
So how does this connect to the events described in Zechariah 14?
Well, I think it's significant that this future gathering of nations in Jerusalem centers around Sukkot. It suggests that this new era won't be about imposing God's rule through force or coercion, but about inviting the nations into a relationship with him, a relationship characterized by dependence, trust, and celebration.
It's like God is saying, remember how I provided for my people in the wilderness? Well, now I'm inviting all nations to experience that same provision and protection under my rule.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It highlights the grace and generosity of God's invitation, even to those who initially opposed him. It's a picture of reconciliation and restoration on a global scale.
But this invitation isn't without consequences.
Right.
Zechariah mentioned something about those who refuse to participate in this pilgrimage to Jerusalem.
Yes. Verses 17 through 19 describe the consequences. For those who choose to disobey, it specifically mentions Egypt as an example, stating that they'll face drought and the same plague that struck the armies if they refuse to come and worship God.
It seems like a stark choice. Align yourself with God's kingdom and experience blessing, or persist in rebellion and face judgment.
It's definitely a call to make a decision, to choose where your allegiance lies, and a reminder that while God's invitation is open to all, it's not something we can take for granted. or reject without consequences.
You know, this idea of choosing allegiance really resonates with me. It's not just about outward rituals or showing up at a festival. It's about a genuine heart transformation, a willingness to submit to God's rule in every area of our lives.
I completely agree. Zechariah is painting a picture of a world where God's sovereignty isn't just acknowledged intellectually, but embraced wholeheartedly, impacting every aspect of life, from the grand political structures to the most mundane everyday activities.
So even the horses' bells and cooking pots
Yeah,
are inscribed with "consecrated to Adonai."
that's right. Verse 20 describes this pervasive sense of holiness that permeates every aspect of life in the New Jerusalem. Even everyday objects like horses' bells, cooking pots, are set apart for God's service. This signifies a time of complete dedication, where every facet of life is aligned with God's will.
It's like that saying, "In all thy ways acknowledge him." It's a reminder that our faith isn't just something we do on Sundays. It's meant to permeate every aspect of our lives.
Exactly. Zechariah is pointing to a future where that integration of faith and life is fully realized, not just for individuals, but for entire communities and nations.
It's a challenging but also inspiring vision, isn't it? It makes me wonder how we can cultivate that kind of pervasive sense of holiness in our own lives today, even amidst a world that often feels anything but sacred.
It's a good question, and one that deserves further exploration, but perhaps we can pick up that thread in the next part of our deep dive.
That sounds like a great plan. For now, let's pause here and give our listeners a moment to process everything we've covered so far.
Yeah, I agree. This chapter is packed with so much rich imagery and profound theological concepts that it deserves time to be contemplated and absorbed.
To our listeners, we encourage you to reread Zechariah 14 and reflect on its message. What stands out to you? How do you see these prophecies shaping your understanding of God's plan for the world and your place within it? We'll be back soon to continue our exploration, but for now, let these ideas simmer and see where they lead you.
Welcome back to the Olive Grove podcast. We've been on quite a journey through Zechariah 14, exploring these dramatic prophecies of transformation and judgment, and ultimately the establishment of God's kingdom.
Yeah, it's been quite the deep dive, hasn't it? From that splitting of the Mount of Olives to the nations gathering in Jerusalem for Sukkot, Zechariah paints such a vivid picture of a world radically reshaped by God's presence and power. Definitely. And we left off discussing this idea of a world where God's sovereignty is fully acknowledged, embraced, impacting every aspect of life, even down to those everyday objects we use. It's a challenging concept to grasp, especially considering, the state of our world today.
It certainly is. But amidst all these grand prophecies and dramatic events, there's this one image that keeps coming back to me, that transformation of the Dead Sea.
Right. That was a powerful one. The Dead Sea, known for its, barrenness, lack of life, becoming a source of life, abundance. It almost seems too good to be true.
It does, doesn't it? But that's the beauty of God's power and grace. He can take what is dead and lifeless and bring forth new life, new possibilities. The Dead Sea becomes like this symbol of hope, a reminder that no situation is beyond God's reach.
It's like a visual representation of the gospel message, isn't it? The idea of being dead in our trespasses and sins, but being made alive through Christ.
Exactly. And just as that Dead Sea is transformed by the fresh water flowing from Jerusalem, we are transformed by the living water of God's Spirit flowing into our lives.
But I imagine that transformation, both for the Dead Sea and for us, as individuals, it isn't an overnight process, right? It's probably more gradual.
You're absolutely right. The text doesn't say that the Dead Sea suddenly becomes a freshwater oasis. It's likely a process, a gradual influx of life-giving water that slowly but surely transforms the environment.
And I think that's an important reminder for us as well. Spiritual growth, becoming more like Christ, is not always this dramatic, instantaneous change. It often involves seasons of, slow, steady growth, moments of struggle, times when we feel like we're barely making progress.
It's a journey of faith, trusting that God is working in us, even when we don't see immediate results. Just as those streams of water persistently flow from Jerusalem, God's grace continuously flows into our lives, nourishing us, shaping us, gradually transforming us from the inside out.
It's encouraging to remember that, especially when we feel discouraged or impatient with our own spiritual progress.
And as we allow God's grace to work in us, we become conduits of that grace to others, like those streams of water flowing from Jerusalem. We can bring life and refreshment to those around us.
It's a beautiful picture of how individual transformation can have these ripple effects, impacting our families, communities, even the world around us.
And ultimately, that's what Zechariah 14 points to, isn't it? A world where God's transforming presence permeates every aspect of life, bringing healing, restoration, true peace.
It's a vision of a world made new, where the curse of sin and death is broken, and all creation is reconciled to God.
And while we may not see the full realization of that vision in our lifetime, we can still participate in its unfolding.
By allowing God's grace to transform us, being agents of reconciliation, peace, in our own spheres of influence, living with that sense of expectancy, knowing that God is working out his purposes in ways we may not fully comprehend.
And that's really the heart of the message, isn't it? We don't have to have all the answers or understand every detail of God's plan. What matters is that we trust in his character, his goodness, his faithfulness to fulfill his promises.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Zechariah 14, what are some key takeaways you hope our listeners will carry with them?
I'd say 3 things come to mind. First, remember that God is sovereign. He is in control even when things seem chaotic or uncertain. Second, God is a God of transformation. He can take what's broken, lifeless, and bring forth new life, new hope, new possibilities. And finally, God invites us to participate in his plan of redemption, renewal, not just as passive recipients, but as active agents of his grace and love in the world.
Those are powerful reminders, and I hope our listeners will continue to reflect on them long after this episode ends.
Me too. This chapter is so rich with meaning and imagery that it deserves to be revisited and pondered.
And we'd love to hear your thoughts. What resonated with you in Zechariah 14? What questions or insights did it spark for you? Feel free to share your reflections with us on social media or in the comment section on YouTube.
Absolutely. We always appreciate hearing from our listeners, engaging in these conversations.
And speaking of YouTube, be sure to subscribe to the Olive Grove podcast channel so you don't miss any of our future deep dives. We've got some fascinating topics lined up. We can't wait to explore them with you.
And for those of you who want early access to our episodes and a chance to connect with a vibrant community of fellow explorers, we encourage you to visit the My Christian Space website.
My Christian Space is a wonderful online hub for all things, the Olive Grove podcast, and so much more. You'll find articles, resources, a community of like-minded individuals passionate about faith, learning, making a difference in the world.
And of course, don't forget about the incredible work of Enduring Freedom Ministries, especially their efforts to establish that vital food pantry in Jerusalem.
We'll have all that information about how you can support their mission in the show notes.
We truly believe that together we can help bring nourishment and hope to those in need.
Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into Zechariah 14. It's been a fascinating journey exploring these prophecies and their implications for our lives today.
I completely agree. It's been a privilege to unpack this chapter with you and our listeners.
And as always, we encourage you to keep seeking, keep exploring, keep the conversation going. Thanks for joining us on the Olive Grove podcast.